Hello, hello, hello. My name is Lord Hearthrasher, first Sea Lord of the Lake of Windermere, self-confessed taboo and occasional enjoyer of history stuff on YouTubes. And today I am livid. Livid, I tell you. Why, you may ask? Well, because a YouTuber I really like very slightly misspoke for a few seconds in a 40-minute long video. I know, shocking stuff. As a result, I'm going to attempt a sort of reaction video. But, not the whole thing, because that would be madness. But instead to a segment about 21 minutes in. Look, people do this to me in the comments all the time, so I'm going to abuse my powers and we're going to get to talk about something really cool, the Mulberry Harbours on D-Day. So, allow me to introduce the subject of today's rant. Fabulous, famous YouTube historian and all-round decent human being, the Fat Electrician. Well, obviously that's not his real name. I assume his parents weren't clairvoyant, and he didn't emerge into this world as a fully qualified Sparky. That'd be weird. So no, they called him Nick. And you should subscribe to him immediately if you haven't already. Nick makes really rather wonderful videos on here, much as I do, but biggerer and Americanerer than me. And he tells his stories brilliantly, and is rightly vaunted as one of the best on the web at what he does. He's funny, sweary, engaging, knowledgeable, a hoot, as I believe that no one in the United States says today. To tell these stories, sometimes he has to skip some of the detail or simplify. You know what, that's fine, cool. Tell the damn story, as he would say. Recently, he picked up on Agent Garbo as a subject, and that's fucking awesome because no one knows about Garbo, and my god, it's such a good story, and he gave it the full Fat Electrician treatment. You should watch it. And when you finish watching it, I also recommend you go and read Ben McIntyre's book. It's called Double Cross, because there's so much more here than anyone can really tell in a short YouTube video. I'll pop a link in the description. Anyway, as can sometimes happen when enthusiastic Americans start to discuss the invasion of Europe, we Brits, and by extension most of the rest of the English-speaking world, can get a little bit nervous. So it didn't come as a complete surprise when he said this.
Now, D-Day in that of itself is pretty controversial. The British did not want to do D-Day.
Look, that's not how it went down. It doesn't particularly matter, but in May of 1943, at what was called the Trident Conference, the British and Americans came together and both agreed that doing D-Day was important, that we would invade in a year's time. The problem prior to that had been, look, it doesn't matter. This is just a fun video. I'm going to calm down. Let's move on. This has just been fun. Let's move on.
A few moments later.
Okay, humor me. Let's just assume all of that works. What about the lack of a harbor? Don't worry about that. We'll make one back home in America and bring it with us.
I'm sorry. What? I can feel my top lip getting a proper wobble on. You know what? It's on like 18-12. Jenkins, get the old coats out, polish the tap. We're going to burn that stupid palace of theirs down again. All right. Everybody just calm down. Stiff upper lips have been restored. Calm. I would, after all, normally offer to duel a man like this, but unfortunately he probably knows how to fire a pistol, and I don't. So let's do this the nice way. The United States has a fuck ton of stuff to be super excited and very proud of, and I'm fucking here for that. Midway, balls of pure steel. The whole grind through the Pacific Islands. Honestly, I doff my cap in respect. That shit was insane. US industrial output during the war? Jesus Christ, that was superpower shit before we knew what a superpower was. Normandy and using Shermans to go straight through the Bocage. Pure American genius. The fight in the Ardennes Forest in December of 1944? Pure guts. The US AAF going again and again against targets despite the losses, wiping out the Luftwaffe in the process. I have nothing but love for that. But this harbour, a US idea? No, mate. That was an all-British affair, and a lot of concrete and things called spuds and beetles. So step to one side, Nick, and let me tell you what really went down there. Imagine, if you will, this scene. It's July 1943 and we are on board the ocean liner Queen Mary, at the time one of the world's largest, fastest and grandest ocean liners, on the way to the Quebec Conference in August of 1943. A number of men are standing around staring at a bathtub in one of the luxury cabins, and amongst them are some really important people like Lord Louis Mountbatten, commander of Britain's Special Forces, which at the time was known as the Combined Operations HQ, Sir Dudley Pant, First Sea Lord and the man responsible for the largest navy in the world, and a preeminent physicist, a chap called J.D. Bernal. And this collection of men are standing next to a group of very hard-bitten naval officers who've spent most of this war, now 4 years, fighting pretty much continually. And all of the eyes of all of these men are locked on a half-filled bathtub. The objects of their collective fascination are not rubber ducks, as one might expect to find in a gentleman's tub, but instead a flotilla of 11 little newspaper ships gently bobbing on the surface. At the command from Admiral Sir Dudley Pant, the professor takes a back brush off the rack, it was that kind of a bathroom, and used it to create waves, which promptly sank all 11 craft. 11 more toy vessels are then put into the water, with an old-fashioned life jacket is produced, something which is universally at the time known as a Mae West, after the rather well-endowed American actress. God, she was beautiful. Anyway, this Mae West was inflated, and as everyone watched, the 11 fresh newspaper boats floated within the protective bosom, so to speak, of the life jacket, and once more the backbrush was vigorously deployed to try and sink the little blighters, but all of them were protected and stayed afloat, no matter how vigorously the brush was moved. And so it was the concept of the Mulberry Harbour was demonstrated to senior staff for the first time. There is an old and somewhat trite saying that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. The stark fact was, for the D-Day landings, codenamed Operation Overlord, to actually work, the Allies needed to land 5 divisions for the assault on day 1, plus another 4 to follow them up. That's a total of 9 within 24 hours. And within a matter of days, a further 20 divisions would need to be landed. Assuming that an average division size was around 12,500 men, it actually varied a little bit between the Allies. That meant that within 3 weeks there would be more than 360,000 men on shore, plus all the supporting air elements, army-level support structures, commands, hospitals, engineers, journalists, and so on and so forth. Let's call it a nice round 400,000 men in all. We could do a little bit of maths here, because each division in Europe consumed somewhere around 700 tons of supplies a day, more if they were fighting. That meant on day 1 the invasion force would need a minimum of 4,500 tons of stores offloaded onto the beaches. By the time there were 400,000 troops ashore, it would mean to be more like 14,500 tons every single day just to keep fighting. Logically, the way that you do this is by landing everything at a port, right? You'll just go and take one and it'll be cool. Except, in 1942, the British and Canadians had launched a raid on Dieppe on the coast of France, primarily to test the feasibility of capturing and holding a port for any period of time, and it had been a clusterfuck. Tanks had got stuck in the shingle, radio comms had broken down, the plan was bloody stupid, the backup plan went to rat shit immediately, German defences were far stronger and far deadlier than anticipated, and basically everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The Canadians lost 68% of their total strength, and overall losses were more than 4,500 killed, wounded and captured from an assaulting force of just over 10,000. To this day, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who'd pushed to have the raid go ahead, is slightly less popular than rabies in parts of Canada. As a fat electrician points out in his video, the Allies had looked at trying to take the ports of Calais and Cherbourg and their massive defences and went, you know what, we've always really liked beach holidays, let's go there. And so Overlord was a beach landing. In a meeting following the raid, Commodore John Hughes Harlett of the Royal Navy had declared to much amusement of the assembled Allied brass that if they were to ever invade Europe, they would simply have to take a harbour with them. The laughing died down somewhat as the assembled Royal Navy officers realised that he was serious, and smiles became frowns when Hughes Harlett told them what was worse, they were going to have to work with the Army, who were well advanced in their planning for doing exactly that. The Army had in fact been thinking along these lines for a few years now. As far back as 1940, with the evacuation of Dunkirk, it had occurred to the British Army that they would need to land, possibly opposed, possibly not at a port, and possibly to offload a lot of shit onto a beach in a hurry. In 1941, the Army's Director of Transport under Major General Donald McMullen had set up a department called TN5, which dedicated itself to the question of how one does offload a lot of stores in a short space of time without a safe harbour, probably whilst some bugger is taking potshots at you with one of these. Oh, and how do you do this in the English Channel, where the average tidal difference is around 40 feet, when midsummer storms are pretty much guaranteed, and when the Atlantic meets the European coastline, which creates a permanently pyramidal swell? Yeah, bit of a challenge. In the Med, and later in the Pacific, the US Navy had come up with something called the Navy Lighter Pontoon, or NLP, which was codenamed much more coolly as the Magic Box. It was bloody clever, a set of steel rafts that sort of clipped together a bit like you would with Lego, forming a floating roadway, or a roadway which could be sunk to help vehicles wade ashore, say over coral, or indeed turn into rafts called rhinos, and float vehicles ashore. It was genuinely brilliant, but not really able to cope with larger vessels trying to dock against it, and it was untested in tidal waters like those of the Channel. As it turned out, rhino ferries would indeed wind up being used extensively to support the landings, but no one knew that at this point. Putting a new harbour down, especially putting one down basically in harm's way, ain't easy. Harbours do a few things. They have deep water so that vessels can approach. They have protective barriers to keep the worst of the sea action at bay. They typically have good connections to road or railway so that stuff you've offloaded can go somewhere quickly and not block the port up. Given that it was unlikely that the Germans would allow the Royal Navy to merrily dredge the sea floor unmolested, and the troops on shore would be reasonably unhappy if they had to wait a couple of years for their tea rations, this meant that the harbours would need to be set up in water deep enough for vessels to approach, far enough off the coast to avoid the worst of the attacks, but also at the same time be set up very bloody quickly. From this, everything else flowed. You would need some kind of pierhead for the ships to dock on. With offloading capabilities there, you'd need a roadway then to connect it to the shore, and as these things were likely to be fairly flimsy, you'd also need a shed load of breakwaters to protect them from the worst of the sea action. And then you probably want a line of breakwaters somewhat closer into the beach in order to allow small craft to shelter in bad weather and operate more easily when they were trying to offload things onto the shore. Taken together, this was the Mulberry system. Well, actually, as ever, not quite, because technically those close-in breakwaters would be known as gooseberries. They were not technically part of the Mulberry, but look, they were built alongside them, so who the hell cares whether they were or they weren't officially? They were part of the system. With these essential requirements mapped out, there was only one small question left. How? And so it was to this task that TN5 now dedicated itself. Major Vassal Steer Webster, a British name if ever there was one, was charged with trying to make these concepts a reality. He was given the imaginatively titled Number 1 Transportation Fixed and Floating Equipment Development and Training Depot to command. I mean, honestly, what little boy hasn't lain in bed at night just itching to join the Number 1 Transportation Fixed and Floating Equipment Development and Training Depot and just stick it to the enemy? After some wrangling with the Cabinet Office and various others, he was given a stretch of the Solway Firth in Scotland to use as a testing ground. It was about as close to the conditions as could be found in Normandy as Scotland could offer, with very similar tidal rises and falls, and of course importantly was out of the prying eyes of the Germans, and relatively simple to cordon off for security. I mean, I say that, in reality a number of local fishermen pretended not to notice what was going on around them, and Steer Webster pretended not to notice that there were fishermen in his cordon, provided that the occasional salmon or lobster turned up in the mess from time to time. A good system for all, I think you'll agree. Anyway, he was given some seriously big toys to play with, often involving a lot of floating concrete. I should explain. There were a few things that were going on in the British economy at the time. There were very few skilled labourers capable of welding, riveting and cutting steel to the dimensions that were required who weren't already dead or at the front or hadn't been deployed into protected industries like tank building. Moreover, steel in and of itself was in incredibly short supply and demand was very high, so every ton of steel saved was a ton that could be a tank or a ship or whatever. And what, you may ask, could replace that steel? And indeed the army asked themselves the same question, and knowing nothing at all about floating things, they went, well, obviously concrete. I will remind you at this point in time, in 1942, the British were also seriously considering making an aircraft carrier out of wood pulp and ice, and no, I am not kidding, but we really don't have time for it today. Let's just move on and accept that floating fucking concrete was not the weirdest boat-building material that anybody had come up with in the war. Now, I don't know about you, but I tend not to think of concrete as really being the ideal substance to make floaty things from. Bomb shelters, sure. Dodgy 1980s skyscraper scams involving the mafia in downtown New York, sure, why not? Even somewhere to hide the bodies of my enemies, but not boats. Turns out this wasn't as nuts as it sounds. In the First World War, the Royal Navy had developed a line of ocean-going tugs made of concrete, known colloquially, and I can only apologise for this pun here, as the Crete Fleet. Yes, sorry about that. The army looked at this and went, yeah, well, okay, I guess what do we know about the sea? It should work, and let's crack on. Wherever they could in the design, the army swapped steel for concrete and reduced the total steel bill by nearly 20%, whilst presumably the Royal Navy stood back somewhat aghast and wept into their cups. Back up in Scotland, special precast hollow concrete floats known as beetles sat under steel sheeting to form the pier and the first section of the roadway and were tested and proved to work. Through these platforms ran legs down to the sea floor in great big pylons which look a little bit like the chimneys on top of old-fashioned paddle steamers in the Mississippi. These things were called spuds, and what they did is they allowed the whole platform to move up and down with the tide whilst being held firmly in place so it didn't shift from side to side, making docking a lot easier. A pierhead 200 feet long and 60 feet wide was built and floated across a number of these beetles, and the whole thing was then tensioned using cables, and it allowed vehicles to drive at 40 miles an hour off the pontoon and down the roadways to the beach. I'll be honest, if Jerry was lobbing shells and bombs at me, I'd probably want to go a lot faster than 40 miles an hour, but you know what, speed limits are speed limits, they're there for a reason, and in this particular case, if you were to screw it up, you'd wind up in the drink. These pierheads would have to cope with a number of different kinds of ships coming in to dock with them, so details of the difference between efficiency and failure here. The Allies used Liberty ships for moving standard cargo across the Atlantic, and a thing called a landing ship tank, or an LST, for moving fairly large amounts of vehicles, and you guessed it, tanks, on two decks, which could, in theory, drive up to a beach, disgorge their contents, and then reverse back out to sea. And then finally you had LCTs, or landing craft tanks, which look a bit like a slightly bigger kind of thing that you would use to move troops around, which could move a smaller number of tanks or other vehicles onto the beach more easily. Clearly, Liberty ships could not come up to the beach and had to have fairly deep drafts. The LST sounds great, but once you put 400 foot of ship onto the beach, and these things weighed about 3,800 tons all up, you ain't getting it off in a hurry. It'd mean typically sitting on the beach under fire until the tide picked you back up and moved you out again, so about 6 hours' time? This was not just very bad for the crew's health, as most of them suffered from very, very highly allergic reactions to bullets and shells, but also incredibly inefficient, as each LST would be tied up for at least 6 hours between landings. Using a pier of some kind would massively speed up the process of unloading and, of course, make it much safer for the crew. The LSTs were designed to land on beaches up slight inclines, so TN5 built a metal ramp that kind of simulated a beach and allowed the LSTs to effectively mount themselves on the pierhead, docking not just with the pier but also with a secondary rise ramp, meaning that vehicles could drive straight off both decks at once, massively speeding up the offloading process. It was expected that LSTs would form the backbone of the transport effort, and it was hoped in time that Liberty ships could be unloaded directly onto the piers, but not immediately. Nonetheless, the Royal Navy asked the Army to design a system which could operate at least a mile offshore and allow for a roadway that would connect it directly to the beach from there. The roadway came in two flavours, a thing called Swiss roll, which was basically a kind of canvas and wood affair floated on counterbalancing sections, and cables for light vehicles, so that things like jeeps and troops. More heavyweight stuff would need something a bit more serious, so a system called Whales was developed for tanks and lorries, again using lots of steel and concrete floats. And the ends of these systems had kind of clever telescoping ends, which meant that as the tide moved the whole thing up and down, the distance to the shore, although it increased and decreased, would always be touched by the roadways themselves, and they had to be flexible enough to be able to settle on the beach itself at low tide and then rise up at high tide and always keep the roadway open. It was actually really clever bits of engineering in there. I'm not going to go into it because it's nuts and bolts and grease and stuff, but if you want to, you can totally read up on it. I'll give you some links. By June 1943, TN5 was basically happy with each of the individual components for the Peerheads, and the whole thing was sort of mothballed. In July 1943, Overlord was finally given the green light by London and Washington, and orders were prepared to be placed by December for delivery by the 1st of February for 6 Peerheads and 4 miles of pier. This was all jolly clever stuff, but so far all we've actually dealt with is the question of offloading stuff and driving it to the beach. If you cast your mind back to the bathtub we began with, the major problem that we actually have to cope with is wave action, especially in a storm. Protection, as any randy teenager can tell you, is key to consequence-free good times. In this case, the prophylactic was a breakwater based on a Lilo. In 1908, the US Navy had attempted to recover the USS Yankee, which had run aground in Chesapeake Bay. As the weather there was not ideal for the primitive diving equipment that was being used, a huge length of pipe was laid along the sea floor, and then compressed air was bubbled through it to try and create a patch of calm water on the surface and let the salvage operation take place. And it worked. This was kind of cool, and if I may be so bold, a typically American approach to the problem. Initially, the Royal Navy thought that they might try something similar to protect the Mulberries, but despite extensive large-scale trials by both the Royal and the United States Navies, by 1943 it was clear that the amount of gas that would be required to protect the pier and the pierhead a mile offshore and probably 2 or 3 miles across was simply not feasible. And this is where the Lilo comes in. A brief aside here. I'm led to believe that in the United States the word Lilo is confusing and it doesn't mean anything. So you would call them a pool float or an air mattress. In the UK, those things have different meanings. Again, truly, we are two nations divided by language. This is one of these. Cool. Okay, fine. Let's move on. Somewhat serendipitously, given how we began this story, an electrical engineer called Robert Locker came up with a really clever idea with dealing with the waves. He realised that you didn't actually need to interrupt the whole thing. You actually only needed an object that was 15% the depth of the wave, and that you could probably do that with a floating rather than a sunk breakwater. This being Britain in the 1940s, he would have liked to have tested his idea in the garden shed, but since this was a floating device, he, with the aid of his wife, who sewed together various parts of a canvas Lilo, and a biscuit tin, managed to simulate wave action and tested the concept in their garden pond. I mean, obviously. Once assured both that his wife and his idea were okay, he rushed down to the Admiralty to seek support for building a scale model. By July of 1943, with the help of a number of leading British universities and an official Admiralty project called Lilo, a prototype was under construction. After much experimentation, the final product, codenamed Bombardon, was a series of 92 steel boxes, each cross-shaped, 200 feet long, 25 feet wide with a beam of 25 feet, weighing in just short of 300 tons each, which would reduce wave action by some 65%. The best thing about these things was because they floated, they could be towed and tethered wherever you wanted them, so if you needed to move them around because the waves had moved, it was dead easy to do. But they weren't the complete answer. 2 further lines of wave protection would be needed: fixed concrete breakwaters and so-called block ships. For the fixed breakwaters, the Army, surprise, surprise, once more looked lovingly at concrete for the answer. Bloody great big floating caissons had been made before, to about 30 foot by 30 foot dimensions, as platforms for anti-aircraft guns for harbours around the United Kingdom, but what was needed for the Mulberry was on a completely different order of magnitude. Weighing in at 7,000 tons each, or to put it another way, about the same weight as a decent-sized cruise ship today, they were 60 foot high, 100 foot long, and topped with an anti-aircraft battery. Codenamed Phoenix, they were made up of a number of hollow grid boxes which could then be flooded to sink them, and with pumps to raise them again, which presented massive engineering challenges. Honestly, no one was quite sure that they could be made. A number of engineers, not least amongst them was a chap called Sir Ralph Freeman, who had helped to design Sydney Harbour Bridge, were brought in to assist. Each unit would need to be manufactured in a dry dock, floated, ferried to a collection point, sunk there, refloated, and then towed across the channel when they were ready to be used. They had to draw no more than 50 feet of water below the waterline, and once sunk be capable of dealing with waves up to 8 feet high and 120 foot across. And the Mulberry plan called for 212 of these things to be ready yesterday. Making the bloody things proved to be much, much harder than anyone had expected, requiring steel strengthening, moulds, and a hell of a lot of bracing to set the sides in kind of 10-feet sections, which were then woven together with steel strengthening. The target was to have them all ready in February of 1944. Whilst the Army messed about with trying to do things with concrete, the Navy focused on what it does best: ships, and specifically the sinking of them. The plan was to create 2 lines of block ships, that's a navy for ships that are sunk in a careful row to create a breakwater where you needed one. One for the harbour proper, and then 5 smaller ones, known as gooseberries, one for each of the beaches, there to help small craft get in and be protected and operate in a much flatter environment. The gooseberries also provided semi-sunken office blocks to act as admin centres, crew quarters, and even a fueling head for something called Pluto, which we won't go into right now. Lovely combination. Imagine asking where to stow your kit on your first day and being pointed towards a half-sunk hulk sticking out of the swell. It wouldn't even make Jenkins do that. Huge efforts were gone to try and find suitable craft. They had to be over 30 years old, and they had to be suitable for having ballast put in the bottom so that they would sink evenly. These things were then taken up to Scotland and carefully cemented and rigged with explosives to scuttle them exactly where they would be needed. The explosives were set with an electrical cable that ran up to the bridge and literally a big red button and a key. Slight hitch here, it turned out that the insulation wire on these was delicious to the local rat population, necessitating repeated refits, but by May they were ready. It was inevitable that the construction of the Mulberries was delayed a number of times by changes in the basic Overlord plan. The original plan itself had called for 5 divisions to be landed, 2 American, 2 British and 1 Canadian, originally on 3 beaches. That was extended to 6 and then back down to 5. The US and the British Mulberries had originally been planned to be put side by side when it was only 3 beaches, but now they had more area to cover, they needed to spread out, with Mulberry A behind Utah and Omaha, and Mulberry B run by the Brits behind Gold, Juneau and Sword. And this obviously caused huge disruptions as to how much roadway, how big a pierhead, how deep channels would need to be, and they all changed a number of times, which in turn meant changing things like the positioning of breakwaters and block ships and supply routes, which in turn changed the number of things that were being ordered. The idea was that the Mulberry Harbours would originally operate from close to D-Day as possible for at least 8 weeks thereafter, but this was then extended quite rapidly out to the end of September, and in reality, in the end, they wound up running out until mid-November due to operational requirements. This all changed the amount of staff was needed and when it was needed, and replacement parts that might need to be stockpiled, and so on and so on and so on. The numbers here are simply staggering. By the time the 2 harbours were built, they would consume more than 600,000 tonnes of concrete, 130,000 tonnes of steel, and 85,000 tonnes of ballast. 40 block ships would be sunk, and £20 million 1944 pounds would have been spent to build them. That's roughly £1 billion in today's money, for an object which was only ever supposed to be temporary. Production, quite deliberately, didn't actually start until December of 1943 on the not unreasonable grounds that the plans weren't actually finished, and also the Germans might see what was going on and cotton on to what was happening. But this meant they only had about 6 months to actually get everything built and ready, and there were inevitably further delays. By April, the programme was some 8 weeks behind schedule. Churchill himself had to repeatedly get involved to ensure that the supply of labour and steel and dock space and, of course, more bloody concrete was made available. The Peerheads and much of the roadway was a major pain point, and the United States expressed serious concern that the whole thing would not be ready in time. Enough Peerheads and roadway were in fact made ready by the 10th of May, but real problems were found with the LST ramps and the Phoenix caissons. The angle of the clever LST ramps we talked about before was found to be wrong, so the boat's doors couldn't open. In good old-fashioned Army tradition, TN5 engineers simply decided to cut the LST doors up a little bit, and before either the United States or Royal Navy Command were informed of the changes, oxyacetylene torches had been produced, doors had been cut, and a signal sent basically saying, "Yeah, sorry about that, lads, we cut on your ships, terribly sorry, old chap, but what's done is done, no use crying over spilt milk, eh?" This has to be one of the few times the United States Navy hasn't gone kinetic on somebody that's cut up one of their boats. Worse still, the huge Phoenix caissons had been designed to be sunk at their assembly points and then raised again and floated across the channel. But in the hurry to do this, no one had ever actually checked that the pumps that the Royal Engineers had proposed to use could actually move the blocks. And they couldn't. As one naval engineer put it, if the Army had deliberately set out to find the least effective pumps for the job, they would have picked these. Panic ensued as it appeared that the British Army had just managed to waste tens of thousands of tons of concrete and steel and block up a number of Royal Navy harbours to boot. Fortunately, a combined US Navy and Royal Navy engineering task force eventually found a way to fix the problem, but not until the 2nd of June. Armies in wartime do not, as a general rule, have lots of blokes hanging around just doing fuck all. You might be 10 stone wet in your clothes, it doesn't matter, the army needs you to get your tail shot off by charging that enemy trench right bloody now. The British Army, which by 1944 had been fighting for almost 5 years, didn't have a load of men to spare for the number 1 port construction and repair group charged with building Mulberry B for the British. In fact, what they sent were the very dregs from the very bottom of the barrel. These were boys whose idea of a good time was drinking until they were good and fighty, getting into a scrap with a local constabulary, visiting the nearest house of ill repute, and then burning down the officer's mess, which they duly did in training. Twice. An officer sent to oversee their training on Bren guns basically gave up halfway through, declaring that they were, quote, a bunch of bloody goons, and from then on, the rabble who performed remarkable feats of engineering and endurance proudly referred to themselves as goons. The first job that was in front of them was to sink some ships, or at least allow the Royal Navy to sink the block ship markers on the buoys and that the goons had laid out for the gooseberry lines. On the American Mulberry A, just off Omaha, some German 88mm opened up on the block ships and managed, somewhat unwittingly, to sink them pretty much exactly where they were supposed to go, which was awfully decent of them, and they then reported their success on Berlin radio. Fucking winners, those Nazis. Over the following days, British and American block ships were sunk, more or less where they were supposed to, and the harbours began to take shape. In a last-minute change, though, on the Mulberry A, the US Seabees decided that they needed to leave larger gaps between their block ships, despite advice from the Royal Navy that bad weather waves would get in and cause havoc. US efforts overall on Mulberry A were hampered somewhat by a number of factors. They'd had less time to familiarise themselves with just how everything was supposed to fit together. They had a more exposed spot to drop Mulberry A into, and the Germans were not helping because they still held some high coastal ground and every now and again would open fire on the Seabees as they went about construction jobs. The Americans also had a lot less respect for what the weather could do in the Channel. They'd never seen one of the infamous summer storms up close. Nonetheless, Mulberry A offloaded their first tanks onto the beach on the 16th of June, just 10 days after construction had started. By the 17th, an LST was docking every 64 minutes, while dozens of DUWKs, or ducks, the amphibious vehicles developed by the United States Army, swarmed back and forth carrying supplies and men from the pierhead to the shore and bringing wounded back for evacuation to the United Kingdom. During the first 2 weeks of operations, the 2 Mulberry Piers managed to discharge some 27,500 tonnes of supplies each, and a similar amount was discharged behind the gooseberries. But then, disaster struck. Between the 19th and the 21st of June 1944, the worst storm in 40 years hit the English Channel head-on. 90-mile-an-hour winds, huge waves, some over 100 foot long, rolled up the channel and hit the Mulberry Harbours. In 3 days and 3 nights, hundreds of Allied service personnel were killed. The weight of the storm caused the huge concrete Phoenix breakwaters to shift or to flood and then crack, and tore the massive bombards off their moorings and sent them careening towards the harbours. In the darkness, goons fired lines from the decks of tugs to try and get them under control, but often these sheared off or missed, and there was then no choice but to send a man with a line into the roiling water to swim over and lash onto them. Some did not make it. The United States block ships were indeed too far apart, and waves rolled through and hit their piers head-on. Desperate attempts by Seabees were made to raise their pierheads on the spud legs, and eventually these worked when they smashed off the retaining bolts so that the platforms raised and fell with the waves, providing sleeping space for exhausted engineers and a place to rest for the dead. Small craft were tossed on the waves, sunk or smashed against the shore. Something like 340 LCTs and more than 100 other craft were destroyed. The British LST pier at Mulberry B, which wasn't actually ready at the time, was ripped off and driven into the shore, and yet some unloading continued thanks to superhuman efforts of the Goons, who managed to get 1,500 tons of stores to the shore every day. Mulberry B was battered and bruised but operational. Mulberry A was pretty badly smashed up, with one pierhead destroyed completely. As the storm abated, the United States commanding officer Doug Ellsberg was convinced that the damage could be made good. However, one thing which had worked during the storms was the line of gooseberries for the blocking ships close into Utah and Omaha, and many small craft had been able to shelter there. Indeed, offloading had continued whenever weather permitted. The United States Navy had never been totally on board with the Mulberry idea, and the head of the United States Salvage Department, one Commodore W.A. Sullivan, after a cursory glance from the beach, declared that Mulberry A was beyond repair. Many of the Seabees who'd fought so hard to protect their harbour were dismayed by this decision, which felt fairly transparent to have much more to do with rivalry with the British and much less to do with the amount of damage that was in front of them. In the end, this decision, although incredibly disappointing for the Seabees, did more to cement good relations between the Goons on Mulberry B and their fellow engineers in the USN on Mulberry A than anything else possibly could have done. Every effort was made to transfer usable materials from one to the other, including manpower, and the British quickly got their harbour back up to running, thanks to American assistance. By a week after the storm, the first LST was docked. Between the middle of July to its closure in November of 1944, fully 25% of all Allied supplies landed in Europe came through Mulberry B, now manned by British and American crews. And that then is the story of how the British brought a harbour along to D-Day, with our friends from America, of course. Anyway, thank you, Nick, for a fantastic video on Garbo and Fortitude. I thought you might want to know a little bit more about these things, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing about one of the more often overlooked aspects of this extraordinary set of landings 80 years ago. If you like this sort of thing and you want more, then I have an extensive back catalogue for you may wish to peruse, as well as a Patreon, which will give you access to my private Discord, or if that's not your speed, then I too have a merch store, and it's filled with lots of lovely things at a delightfully high markup. I will leave you there then today, my lords, my ladies, my lovelies, my glittering maybes. I bid thee adieu.